really elite climbers seem to have a much higher tolerance for uncertainty than people who are maybe a little bit less elite. And I mean, that is just one of the mental factors that I think goes into really cutting edge climbing. Like somebody that I think is a really good example of this, and I'm just kind of obsessed with what they're doing for cutting edge climbing right now, is Aiden. Like for him to come to America and like do a little bit of the cool, interesting stuff, but then it sounds like mostly he's just trying like V18s, like things that he thinks maybe he's like, oh, I did like 3 of the 8 moves, therefore I'm going to invest my entire life into trying to do this boulder. Like that tolerance for uncertainty is wildly impressive.
Welcome to the Testpiece podcast. This podcast is about all things high-level climbing, how to go from good to great. I'm your host, Joshua Horsley. I've been climbing for over 30 years. We recently updated our Patreon, and now you get exclusive content from the guests that you love. You get your episodes before everyone else, and they're ad-free. Try it out now at patreon.com/testpiece with a free 7-day trial. Okay, let's start the show. Jesse Firestone, welcome to the pod, man. How you doing?
Yo, I'm doing well. Thanks. I'm psyched to be here.
Dude, I'm psyched to chat with you. Our last chat, we just geeked out and then some on beautiful climbing and coaching and everything. And so now we get to do that for even longer.
Nice. Yeah.
Jesse, you are a prolific bouldering developer, mainly in Oregon, I want to say, right? I know you're in Leavenworth area, but that was kind of where you cut your teeth. And you seem to have a specific love for intimidating, beautiful, hard lines. Right up my alley, dude. Just +1 to you going out and adding those to the community. I know you've bouldered up to V13, and recently that was Kingslayer, another beautiful, beautiful line. But Jesse, I'd say you're probably best known as a climbing coach. You've coached people all over the world, helped people who climb V0, V1, all the way up to V16. You know, there's V17 now, by the way. Just you gotta get that climb. There's only a handful though. I also want to point out, Jesse, that you have a damn good Instagram, which honestly is one of the reasons I got psyched to chat with you. I can just tell that you put a ton of effort into it. And I mean, as someone who also puts content out into the community, like, I appreciate it, man. Like, thank you for taking that time and effort to put it out there, because I know it's a bit of a labor of love, despite what people may think.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I hear it a lot from people that I meet in Levy and stuff, that they appreciate my Instagram, which honestly keeps me going, because it is quite a lot of work. And contrary to popular belief, I don't get paid for any of that directly. So.
By the way, I just signed up for some kind of little Instagram meta business thing, and you can get paid. I got one of my paychecks, I think it was 3 cents. I'm glad they didn't send it to me in check form, because that literally would have been worth less than the paper it was printed on. But dude, There you go. You can make dozens of cents.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was like the original goal, was to put some value into the universe, because I really like thinking about this stuff. And whenever I would have conversations with people, it seemed like it was productive. And, you know, I don't want to like toot my own horn. I think sometimes I have good ways to think about things if I'm having a good day. So I'm glad that you enjoyed.
Well, I really did and do. And that's one of the reasons I was psyched to chat with you, is because I can tell that you are thinking about this stuff at more than a surface level, not so much just sets and reps. Not that that's not an important part of coaching and training. You gotta show up and do your exercises. But I was actually just curious along those lines, like, where do you get ideas for these posts? Because they're varied. Like, they are all over the map.
Yeah. Man, I can't help it. I was actually just talking to a client this week that I was like, 5 years ago when I started coaching, I was kind of afraid that I was going to like run out of steam and lose my passion for climbing. And, because when you make something your job, it's really easy to like kind of lose enthusiasm for it. But actually, it's like an infection. It's just gotten worse and worse. I just think about it all the time, and I never lose my enthusiasm or my hunger for it. I think something might be seriously wrong with me, actually. But no,
You've come to the right place.
I have several running like lists on my notes app, of like things that I want to like research more, or like ideas of things to look into. And then I have one that's like actual ideas for content. And then I have one that's like running lists of content. And nowadays I actually have some people helping me turn my ideas into content, but I'm still doing all the creative stuff. But I have somebody that is like helping me with the grunt work of like imagery and editing and all that kind of stuff, which has increased my output, which is really nice. I can focus a little more on like the philosophy and the ideas and stuff and let somebody else handle some of the execution, because that was definitely slowing me down. That was a rate limiter. We'll talk about that later.
Ooh, good tease there. Yeah, I love when I'm climbing alone and I just have these little tiny epiphanies. And I'm sure that you have these as well. And sometimes that can be like the catalyst, but it's so different to package it into a bite-sized thing. And, we could say, oh, that's like a terrible TikTokification of climbing. But there's a different side of it where if you have this little moment or epiphany, and then you have to go through the process of deeply understanding it in a way that can be captured in a paragraph. It's like the other end of the spectrum of what we do, Jesse, like the long form we're doing here is, yeah, but what if you only had 5 seconds to communicate this?
Yeah. So like, just keep in mind when you're talking about Instagram, it's like your caption is only 2,200 characters. And then remember after that 98% of people who look at the content are not going to read the caption. So they just get whatever's in the post. And a lot of people are just going to scroll past the post. So we don't need to get into my strategy too much, but like, I really do try to have like, what is the core message in, big, bold letters, basically on my like content creating philosophy. I'm like, don't bullshit people. I don't do like clickbait unless whatever the clickbait is actually does have something meaningful. Like if I'm going to ask a question, it's not like a rhetorical question. Like I want to actually get people to ask themselves that question. And I almost always try to have my posts have like some kind of takeaway. If I do it right, the takeaway will get shared and it'll make sense without the context. But hopefully it's interesting enough to people that they then read the context and get the real value from it. But I mean, I also make a lot of like bullshit memes too. So it's not all like highbrow philosophy stuff. I also
The meme culture is real. And I don't know, for better or for worse, it's an important part. And I don't know if you've heard me talk about this before, but a lot of the things I've done in climbing, I can trace back to sometimes it's a video, sometimes it's just a picture. And you can encapsulate a lot in an image or a phrase that literally changed my life. Like the one I often think about is there's this climb called La Hostia in Mallorca that no one knows about, no one does, but there's this picture of Ethan Pringle on it. And I just was like, I have to go do that. Like, I don't know what that is. It scared me. It intimidated me. And 10 years later, 2 trips later, I did it. So memes and all this stuff, like, I do love the long form. I love being here with you, Jesse, but I don't want to denigrate that skill and the importance of those little bite-sized things and hopefully using them for good, Jesse, for good.
Yeah, totally. Well, and like, I don't know if you know who Len Nessifer is. He's like a influencer and amazing page because he talks about like super interesting politics stuff, super sharp guy, but he's also a total meme lord. And the thing that I found amazing about this guy is I really realized like he pulled me in with the memes and then I was interested in his other content. And like, he was so good at both. And I mean, it makes sense. Like humor is a sign of intelligence and my memes aren't as good as Len, so I'm probably not as smart as he is. But if you can convey a really complicated idea to someone in a meme format, you're probably a decent communicator. And that's an interesting challenge. So I kind of thrive on that.
Well, there's something about that in coaching as well, where you need to know the right thing to say or capture at the right time for that specific person. And I always talk about this. This is not me being the coach. This is me being climbers with friends. But I love those moments where you see someone climbing and you just know the thing to yell, which sounds terrible. You know, don't interrupt your friends. Don't yell things at your friends. Let them climb. But sometimes it's like, oh, like stay tight, like, or stand up on that, like, or trust that foot. And you just somehow can kind of connect with that person and intuit in that moment, that one specific thing to say. And so I'm sure as a coach, understanding when to put out your message, what the message needs to be, and how to make it digestible is super important, not just in the meme world.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you could talk to someone about for 10 or 15 minutes about their problem and maybe you're going to get to the root of it. But like once you've seen the same patterns a whole bunch of times, hopefully you can condense that conversation to asking them about it and getting them to talk about it. And then, you know, like, okay, I have these 3 things that I might reach for in this case. And they're like mantras or there's something that is going to stick for that person. And the longer I coach, the more I'm kind of building that like arsenal of things that I would try to use for those different situations. Cause the right nudge at the right time is way more powerful than a lecture. You know what I mean? But obviously it's complicated to have the right nudge at the right time.
Any examples there, Jesse, either that you've used on clients or like that you use on yourself?
Yeah, I mean, like this is a really silly example, but one that I really like that I just used with somebody the other day. They were having their first trip to Squamish, and he was saying he was really struggling with the feet, and I was like, breathe out, drop your heels. I was like, I don't need to like tell you about granite and how it works or anything. I was like, just like exhale, drop your heels. And I was just like talking to him. He wasn't out climbing, but hopefully like when he goes out climbing, he's going to think exhale, drop your heels. Another one that I draw on a lot, and actually this is prescient for me because it's in my mind in my own climbing all the time, is just because you can doesn't mean you will. I think that is such a powerful idea in a single sentence. And you can go into tons of depths about like self-efficacy and confidence and mastery and visualization and all this stuff and learn a lot about mindset. But so much of the projecting process can actually be solved if you just say the phrase, just because I can doesn't mean I will. And you acknowledge that. That will really get you pretty far. You don't need a lesson. You don't need like a psychology degree. That single sentence is actually encapsulates a lot of it.
Can you unpack it more for me? Because when I hear that and I think about myself in the projecting process, if I know I can do something like in a session or in a day, like I will be able to say to myself, I can do this. And so I will do it. And then I'm really good at executing in that moment and getting it done in that session. Where I'm not so good at is when I know I can do something and then it kind of drags out over a session or two, I get kind of over it. I'm kind of like, well, I know I can. Like it almost becomes just this game of showing up and less about the realization of that I can do it. I don't know. Maybe I'm phrasing that wrong, but yeah, can we go a little deeper into the idea of can versus will?
Yeah, I think you saying that it becomes a game of showing up is a really useful thing to notice, because once you know you can do it, the only thing that like determines whether you do it or not is, do you show up enough times to prove that you can, that you were right and that you can do it. But I think for anybody who's done really hard red pointing, I think of it as like a liminal space between the point where you know it's possible and actually being able to do it. Because especially with sport climbing, I've had it with bouldering too, but especially with sport climbing, it's like the one hang might be like 15 sessions before the red point, or more than that in a lot of cases, right? You know, when you one hang it, especially if it's a short hang, like, you know, you can do it, but you have no idea what the distance is before you will do it. And really, really good red point climbers can just hang out in that scary liminal space for a very long time without a lot of self-judgment or self-doubt. And so like the power of, I know I can, that doesn't mean I will, is being able to show up without an expectation of the outcome. You're just like, yeah, I'm going to go today. I'm going to try really hard. I know I can do it. I don't deserve to do it today. Doesn't mean I will do it today, but I know I can. So I'm going to keep showing up. That's the power of the idea, in my opinion.
I can't help but ask you then about, how do you cross into that barrier of even knowing that you can do something? Because I think that for some of us, we maybe have egos that are too big. We're able to maybe bite off more than we can chew, but that's an asset where we say, oh, I know I've never tried this grade before, but I can do it. And then you have to keep showing up and have to prove to yourself. And I will say that the more times you do show up and prove to yourself, it's like this self-reinforcing thing that's helpful. But I definitely have been in this place and know a lot of people who struggle with even that initial thing of, this is a grade I've never done or even tried. How do you get to that place of kind of trying that, maybe before you reach that liminal space?
Yeah. I think really elite climbers seem to have a much higher tolerance for uncertainty than people who are maybe a little bit less elite. And I mean, that is just one of the mental factors that I think goes into really cutting edge climbing. Like somebody that I think is a really good example of this, and I'm just kind of obsessed with what they're doing for cutting edge climbing right now, is Aiden. Like for him to come to America and like do a little bit of the cool, interesting stuff, but then it sounds like mostly he's just trying like V18s, like things that he thinks maybe he's like, oh, I did like 3 of the 8 moves, therefore I'm going to invest my entire life into trying to do this boulder. Like that tolerance for uncertainty is wildly impressive. How much of that is cultivated versus how much of it is natural, I don't have a good inclination. I don't have any science to draw on for that. I think there's probably a pretty big degree of both, and probably a lot of like, again, sort of liminal, like, can you hang out in this space where you just don't know how it's going to go? But speaking for myself, because that's somebody I do have expertise on, I have learned a lot about my climbing when I try to go into climbing experiences without putting a lot of pressure on myself to make progress or to have a chance at doing it. And that's especially become true in maybe the last 5 years, where I've focused a little bit more on pure difficulty and actually do want to find out what my potential for myself is, even if that is meaningless on like the global spectrum or whatever. Because you just can't answer that question about yourself by trying to chip away at like small increments of the grades. Like you actually do have to just take really big swings and fail miserably, or you'll never find out like how tolerant you are to uncertainty and like what kind of big things you could do.
Gosh, I feel like there's some interesting duality on this spectrum of knowing you can do something versus taking big swings. And it's like having this deep confidence to just say, yeah, I'm going to just go after this V18. No one's ever done this grade before. And just, having some deep belief that I can do this if I chip away at it. And then there's this other side of it that seems to go hand in hand when I talk to the best people, is that, and they also don't necessarily sit there and think, I can do this. I climb V18. They just give it their all. And I saw this in comp climbers too, where it's not that you want to go out and say, I have to win. I'm a winner. I'm going to win. They have to just go out and give their best performance and let the chips fall where they may, but they also have to somehow deeply believe in their ability that their best performance is, sufficient. And I don't know. I find that fascinating. Endlessly fascinating, to be honest.
I think there's something magical about like dispelling a small amount of the pressure that you're under in order to perform a little bit better. Like there's so many examples of this throughout climbing history where people are like trying to red point something. They have some kind of time limitation or something. And then like whatever happens where they just are not trying to do it anymore. They're just climbing free and flowing and like they do it. It's a staple of the sport, but yeah, you make a good point that it's not something you could just reach into your bag of tricks and like make that happen. That's really difficult to do.
When I talked to Simone Lorenzi, he made some comment about how perfect isn't perfect, or he just basically all of his hardest sends actually came on his second day of climbing in a row where he was tired or conditions weren't perfect, and that he struggled when he was well rested. Conditions are immaculate. And then the pressure was too much. And maybe we can turn this into the first topic that we somehow stumbled into, because it was something that I was really excited about. And that's this idea of peak climbing experiences. And we talked a little bit about them last time, but I want to hear what you really mean by a peak climbing experience. And then I want to have them. So let's go into that too.
Yeah. So to me, I guess what's cool about climbing, which I know it's not the question you asked, but what's cool about climbing is compared to a lot of other sports or activities, it's so multifaceted. Like you can go out and you can have a very physically challenging day. You can go out and have a really emotionally strenuous day. You can have like mentally and like the puzzle solving and the technical complexity. You can just go out and have like a socially interesting day and like hang out with people or meet people. Or, sometimes I'll like run into people from New Zealand that I last met in Yosemite 15 years ago or whatever. It's crazy things like that, and like all of those different facets contribute to having positive climbing experiences. So to me, I think for it to be like a peak experience, it probably is going to include multiple of those or possibly all of them. And like by definition, for it to be challenging or interesting in all of those ways, it's almost like irreproducible. So if I think about the true like peak experiences that I've had, it was just this confluence of events where like it was physically like right at my limit, and maybe it's either a high ball or it's like really hard to put together or really conditioning, or something that's like mentally challenging, and maybe it's scary, so it's like emotionally challenging, or maybe I'm going through some other stuff that's making it more emotionally challenging, and like I'm there with my friends. It just has all of these things, and like when I reflect on it, I'm like, wow, that was a really powerful moment for me. And actually, if I just went back, now that I'm better than I was when I did my first V10 or whatever, if I went back and just did it again, it would no longer satisfy those criteria, because it would be simpler in some ways. And I'm not the same person. I'm not at the same place as I was. I'm not there with the same people. And so like, you can't just reproduce the peak experience. And I think that's what's so interesting about it. Like, I think I mentioned this in the pre-interview, but like when I did Kingslayer earlier this year, I think what hit me so powerfully about it, even though on paper it's like a new grade for me, that didn't seem like the part that was really interesting. What was interesting to me was like, it was this clear peak on the timeline of like, I remember doing my first V3 in the gym. I remember doing my first V6 flash outside. I remember doing my first V10. There are peaks on the landscape. And for me, Kingslayer was just this very obvious, very massive summit. And I'm like, whoa, even if I go back and climb that boulder again, it's not going to be the same as it was. That's what makes it a peak experience. Truly, to me, it was like I had this opportunity. It hit all the things and I took it.
Good boulder to do it on too. Based on how you're first describing it, it sounds like while difficulty is part of it, in the sense that I think it's hard to have a flow experience or a peak experience when some form of difficulty isn't part of it. It could be mentally difficult, right? It could be like it was really dangerous. Maybe it wasn't your hardest physical move, but it pushed you in some limit. I just kind of want to double check and make sure it's not just that it was your highest grade at the time that gave you the peak experience.
Yeah. Well, I think it is really important in order to qualify it as like a peak experience. It is important that in some context, it's like near the limits of what you're capable of, which could just be near the limits of what you're capable of on that day. I don't think it's necessarily important that it be like near your absolute potential. And to give a good example, like I've done a lot of backcountry bouldering. I've wondered all the time, if you took those boulders and you like plucked them out of the backcountry and put them roadside, if they would actually seem as hard as I thought they were when I was doing them after doing like a 10-mile hike, because you're just so sandbagged basically. But it doesn't really matter because you're never going to try those boulders without being sandbagged by the hike. And so it's just part of the experience basically. And all the other stuff, the fatigue of the hike and being in a beautiful place with really tight group of friends and knowing that you're self-reliant out there and everything, that also contributed to it being a peak experience.
Yeah, so the reason why this jumped out at me, Jesse, is just when I look back over my long climbing career now, I mean, career is a loose term. I've been climbing for 30 years, way more than most of my life. And when I think about those moments that I can just recall and feel and remember the holds and sometimes wake up in terror from, there's grades involved, but that's not really the point. The point is that they made deep, deep lasting impacts on me, and I carry them with me proudly and happily, and they're memories that I can visit. And when you brought it up as a topic, I wanted to explore, how to have more of them. Like, I know it's irreproducible, but that doesn't mean that we can't maybe set ourselves up for those moments to happen more likely. And I think they're really what make climbing to me. It's what I love.
I think that's a good point, that it's like you can't force it. The way that I think about it is like in the word peak, basically. Like if you were just having peak experiences every weekend, the landscape would actually just be flat, even if it was at high altitude or high grade or whatever, right? There ceases to be peaks without troughs, which I know sucks. What I think about from a coaching perspective is less of like, can you force yourself to have peak experiences, and more about what you want is for there not to be this like big flat spot on the landscape where there could have been a peak if you had made better decisions or if you had chose to go after the right thing at the right time. Basically, it becomes a question of capitalizing on opportunities when they arise and really understanding how to notice when there's an option for you to do something, or picking the right thing at the right time so you don't wind up with a trough or a flat spot where there could have been a peak. Maybe I'm taking the topology metaphor too far.
No, it's great. That's why they're called peak experiences. And I called this podcast Testpiece. And one of the reasons why I like that word is that when I think about test pieces out there, they were more likely to give me those experiences. I think that's somehow why they're test pieces. And well, I'll just talk about Midnight Lightning for a moment, because it's arguably, it used to be the most famous boulder problem in the world. Who knows nowadays? But it really encompasses a lot of emotion when you climb through the bottom. It tests a bunch of different things, abilities, but the top out is committing, scary, off the deck, requires maybe a skill that you can't really practice until you're up there. I mean, I shouldn't say this. I'm sure there's people who just walk up it, but I was going to say, I don't care who you are. It's an exciting moment to get up on that mantle, to lean forward, feel the air beneath your butt, and, grab that final crimp. And it's a memorable moment. And so again, I like the idea of trying to set these up, because I know that when I'm 90 years old, well, I'm still going to be climbing, hopefully, but I'm not going to be thinking about, oh, I'm so proud of that grade I did. I'm going to be remembering the Midnight Lightning mantle. As I said that, I remembered it, man.
Yeah, man. I mean, I have a I have a rule with myself that I don't do tick lists or like life lists anymore. I deleted all those notes and I don't do any of that stuff anymore. But I sort of believe that if something is really important to you, you know that you want to do it someday. That's enough. I don't need to write it down anywhere. And man, Midnight Lightning is probably at the top of my imaginary list. If I was to, if I was to recreate a list, I tried it in 2009 and I haven't tried it since. And I was not very far into climbing at that point. So I got spanked.
We have a lot more pad technology now, by the way.
Yes.
It'll be much safer. It's worth it. Highly recommend. So let's try to think about some of these factors that one can control or maybe they can't, that can lead them to it. And I think we set us up well for why one might want to have a peak experience, because I think it's, again, what you'll remember at 90. But yeah, Jesse, like, how do we do it, man?
That's a tricky question. It's going to depend on every climber and what they have available, what they want to do, what's the most compelling to them, all that stuff, right? Because if you want it to be really challenging, you need to have a good understanding of what you're good at and what you're bad at and what might suit those things. And so one way that I think about that is to think about finding projects where you have to reach as high as you can. And obviously the really logical thing for a lot of people is going to be grades. So like if you climb this grade, you're going to want to try to climb the next grade. That's just a very easy way to think about it. I have a lot of cynicism about grades, but that is one place that they're valuable. Is all other things being equal, a V12 is probably harder than a V11. That's like one thing that you can get from grades. So when you think about raising the ceiling, grades are one way to do it. I also think you can think about raising the ceiling in terms of like looking for types of climbs that you would usually avoid, looking for whole disciplines of climbing that you usually are not as interested in. I could get into talking about high balls, but I'll table that temporarily. The other thing I think is important to having peak experiences, some people talk about working their weaknesses, which I think is valuable, but I think about it more as raising the floor. So like the higher the floor is, the further you can reach, basically. And I'm trying to color a lot of this in terms of Kingslayer just because that's the peak experience for me. That's the most recent. It has a lot of moves on it that in recent years are not things that I have been doing as much of. Like the crux at the top is like very board climbing style. I don't do that much of that style. And so I was really glad when I did it that I was better at that style than I remembered, but I also was very intimidated by the prospect of trying it because I knew that it was like a notoriously board style, powerful problem. And so that illustrates the importance of like, I had tried to keep up with that a little bit and try to like raise my floor in that powerful style, even though I'm getting a little bit like slower and less powerful in recent years, just naturally. No. Oh, sorry. Oh yeah.
Don't say
never
that.
Mind.
I've banished all this negative talk about getting older. I think it's whatever you tell yourself, you're right.
Let me add some context. I went to Rocklands 7 years ago, and I am actually lower body way more powerful than I was when I went to Rocklands 7 years ago. So I actually want to go to Rocklands again and see if I'm better at jumping than I was then, because I think I probably am. In cases like Kingslayer, really what it's about is the number of falls I can take in a session. And I agree with you. I want to be optimistic about my age, but that type of powerful climbing is just something I'm a lot more careful with the dosage of these days. That I think is important.
So you said earlier that what would be really cool for us, but also people you work with, is that you don't want them to have a bunch of flat time. You want those peak experiences to be able to occur. Obviously, like you were saying, they can't occur all the time. Otherwise, by definition, they're not peaks. And this idea of recognizing when the planets align and then being able to execute and make it happen, or I don't know if make it happen is the right word, because there's a big confluence of events, but I can think of a recent peak experience I had, and there was an element of, there was a lot of things telling me not to move forward. And it was very easy to kind of give up. I had lots of excuses. I know you were telling me that leading up into Kingslayer, you actually had some health issues. You weren't having like a banner season that should lead to a peak experience. And maybe we can talk more about how, even if you can't exactly notice when this may occur, how to do your best when perhaps it is about to happen.
Yeah, it's super situational. I think, so first of all, it ties back to that whole tolerance to uncertainty thing. And I originally tried Kingslayer last year, and I just tried it in a very open-minded way. I didn't write it off or anything like that, but I tried it. It felt super fucking hard, if I'm if I'm being honest, last year. And then this year, I knew that I was going to go to it again. I had a friend who was kind of pushing me a little bit to try it, which I'm incredibly thankful for. This is one actionable piece of advice I think people could walk away with. even if you don't think that you're in better shape or you don't think that you've progressed significantly since the last time you tried something that seemed really hard for you, just like scrub the board clean and show up and be curious and see what happens. Because that first session last year, I wouldn't say it was unproductive, but I got sucked into some ideas that maybe weren't as useful, you know, and I spent the whole session on those ideas. And so I walked away with one concept of the boulder. And then the first time I went back to it this year, I just tried a few different things and that boosted my confidence. And then I tried the things, you know, some other sections that I had tried before, but I was feeling more confident about the boulder as a whole. And so basically I was just able to sort of fool myself into continuing to try it and staying curious. And that wound up basically opening the door for me to be like, oh, I can actually see that I could do this, but I need to drop everything else that I'm doing. I'm not training. I'm not lifting weights during the week. I'm not going to any other things, because it's also a pretty committing day for me. It's like 2 hours away. I was like, I'm setting my whole week up around trying this thing every weekend, whether Saturday is a better day or Sunday is a better day. And I'm not doing anything else until I come as close as I can to setting this boulder, basically. I saw that window was open on the first day and I just fucking dropped everything else in my life.
What if you had come up empty-handed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and again, it's hard not to go back to the uncertainty thing, but I think one cool thing about climbing on boulders like Kingslayer or Midnight Lightning is if you're far enough into climbing that you understand what makes you tick, that you kind of get your motivations, it should be theoretically easy to get to a place where you enjoy the process more than you enjoy the outcome. And another thing that I harp on a lot is like, I love the day that I sent Kingslayer, dude. And I felt sad after I did it. I had an existential grief because I was like, I may never line up everything as well as I did, or as luckily as I did for that. Like I might never have a better experience in that. And that's kind of sad, right? But also I can't live in that moment. And I don't want to spend the rest of my climbing life chasing after that moment and thinking that that's something I'm going to have again. But I can live my life in trying to have another moment like that by doing the work that's necessary to set it up. That is my actual life, is the process of trying to do it. And so that's where I want my energy to be spent. And like, yeah, it would have sucked if I hadn't done it, but I would have just tried to do it in fall.
A weird duality I've come upon as I get older in climbing is that, first of all, tops matter. And that's what we're doing. We climb to the top of things. We tick them like that. That is, we go from the bottom to the top with whatever little rules and games we play on those. But that's kind of what climbing is. And then there's a whole nother side of climbing that, you know, I get drawn to these lines. Maybe I saw a picture or whatever. And I remember I was in Turkey on my honeymoon. There's some climb with just these tufa features that just, I don't know, man. I wanted it. I wanted to climb on them. Unfortunately, it was like one of the last days there. I gave it a really good flash go. I fell like just right at the anchors, and I really tried hard. I put it all out there. I didn't feel bad about my attempt, and I didn't do the climb. And if I were to guess, I probably will never go back and get to do it or even try it again. But I climbed on that feature I really wanted to. I had a great experience on it. I don't really have a bunch of regrets. And it's this weird thing where the idea of like, love the process, but then you also want to get to the top. I don't know if I have it totally reconciled other than finding joy in both of them, really.
Yeah. You know, so you don't regret that you didn't do it. I think that's really a good thing. That's smart. But probably if you had half-assed it, or if you had opted not to try it because you were worried that you wouldn't be able to do it, you probably would have regretted those scenarios. So right there, I feel like you made the right call. And so much of being satisfied with your climbing is just accepting that you can't do everything. And like, I don't know if this is true, so we'll see what people think about this, but I think a lot of people who are maybe in the more like moderate grades or even some of the advanced grades now, but are not at the elite grades, they look at elite climbers, especially with modern social media, and they think that elite climbers are just sending it all the time. But like, I almost think it's the opposite. I think the more elite you are, the more days you go out and just get absolutely pummeled. And you have to be able to continue moving forward like that. And like, for me, that's been pretty key, honestly, in order to like, you know, I've made very slow progress, but steady, slow progress for the last chunk of years. And a lot of it has just been like, yeah, I didn't do that V13. I'm just going to move on and try this other one. Oh, didn't do that one either. Picked up a couple injuries. I'm just going to rehab those injuries and move on to the next one. Like, because that's what I want to do. I want to climb the hardest things I can. And that means failing.
Yeah, there's definitely some amazing analogy for all of life, but I'll keep it more climbing specific, where climbing's fun. If you're having fun climbing, you want to keep on climbing. You want to play this game that's iterative, that you can play forever. And if the whole thing around it is either reaching a single grade, so you're like V10 is like my ultimate goal, well then, I don't know, you might actually achieve it, and then you're screwed because that was the game you're playing. And then if all it is to get to a higher grade, I got bad news for you. Right after V17 is V18, and it's still there, and it's going to be rough if all of your chasing is just going to be for a grade, because it's not a game that you can play when you're 90, like I was, projecting my future self. And so finding the joy. Well, and actually, maybe we can tie this into, I think it was a recent post that you did that I really like, around kind of like finding your true motivation or something along those lines. I think that might be related here.
Yeah, I think this is the red convertible thing. So like, I kind of tie it back to like the idea of like in a midlife crisis, the sort of prototypical thing that somebody does is they go out and buy like a convertible red Beamer, like a Miata or something. I don't know. And it's like, is that actually producing any happiness for you? Or is that just like the thing that you sort of assume is something cool that you would do when you're going through that? And I'm not trying to disparage people who just want to climb V10 or just want to climb V12. I don't think there's anything wrong with those goals necessarily. I just want people to make sure that the goal that they're trying to achieve is like internally aligned with what actually brings them satisfaction in climbing. And so one way that I frame this is, I frame a lot of things this way, so people may have heard this before if they see my stuff. I think performance, progression, and fulfillment are like the three kind of North Stars for climbers. You can go towards more than one of them at the same time. It's not like it's always one or the other. It's always a mix. And a lot of the time, performing really well makes you feel like you've progressed, and it's very fulfilling. So it's like polluted, right? But I think a lot of suffering in climbing comes from people driving really hard towards one of those things, when actually what they want or what they would find the most interesting or most compelling at the time is one of the other things. Like doing a whole season of base building when what you actually really want to be doing is climbing the hardest thing that you possibly can is really emotionally challenging. Sometimes it's necessary, but you are going to suffer a little bit. And then the classic like red convertible thing would be people just going out and trying to project the hardest thing that they can project every week, every season, over and over and over, because that's kind of the goal that they've accidentally picked up from social media. And I honestly think that that produces a lot of suffering. I think that there are people out there who are trying to do that because they see that that's what seems cool. And maybe they don't actually enjoy it as much as they think they do. Maybe they still want to do it because some suffering is necessary, but yeah.
It's funny, Jesse, I was giving you crap about how one of your posts, I felt like, I was like, oh, that may be good advice for people who want to be good, but what about for people who want to be great? But what I would argue is that what you were just talking about there is the key to greatness, and that you will never be great at something that you don't actually want to do. Or at least that's my argument. And I've had people push back on me and given me one or two examples, but I don't think Chris Sharma is up there miserable on Espontis. I don't think he's like, God, I just wish I could be playing Call of Duty or something. That's not, that's my hunch. I'll ask him. I also, I don't know. I think it's an important thing when it even comes to progression and training, because people will ask me, oh, should I climb on the moon board or the tension board or the kilter board, or should I actually hang board? I'm like, which one do you love and you will actually try hard on? Because I mean, I always think that that's one of the keys to training, actually trying hard. Like if you tell someone, go do 5 reps of your bicep curl, and they do it, but they're just, on their phone listening and they're not really trying hard. Actually, I don't want to put out there that I think bicep curls will make you better at climbing. But anyways.
Yeah. I almost said this a minute ago, but that makes me want to say it now, is like, the V13 number definitely got my foot in the door to try Kingslayer. I was like, it looks fucking so sick in videos and stuff. And I was like, it seems very compelling. And also it's this hard grade that I want to climb, so I'll go try it. But like, if the first day that I had tried it this year, I had heard that it was like every person who had ever done it had downgraded it to V11, I don't think that it would have changed my enthusiasm to climb it in the least, honestly. It was like once I scrambled up that hill that it's on and like came up over the little like landing that's built up and like looked up at it, I was like, holy shit, like that is a boulder problem. Like you want to climb that boulder problem. Like I don't care what arbitrary assumption somebody else has of like how hard it is or whatever. I just wanted the thing. And in that sense, like it's easier for me to get myself to a really high performance state because actually what was driving me was just the fulfillment of climbing on something that's so compelling. And I was going out there with like a really good buddy. So it was like always good vibes, you know? I was trying to perform, and definitely in the later sessions, I was extremely focused on performance, but it didn't feel that way. And I personally do better when I feel like fulfillment is what I'm really driving for. Like I am also excited about going out and brushing a V4 or whatever. Like I love those parts of the sport. So if I can twist the performance to be fulfillment, it's very satisfying.
I agree. I also want to push back because you said that the idea it was V13 was attractive to you. And like, there is just this thing that I don't want to discount. Like, we're sitting here waxing philosophical. And the reason why I do think this part is important is that when you're up there way high up off the deck on a high ball, V2, V20, like the terror is real and the grade seems meaningless. It just doesn't matter. And so those peak moments we're talking about are so deeply internal and subjective that your comparison of the grade to your peer group just kind of falls away in that moment. But I would be lying to say if some of the projects that I've chosen in the past and continue to choose did not somehow attract me because I want to know how I measure up. I don't know. I just want to give that what it's due,
I don't think you're pushing back at all. And let me say this to add some fuel to what you're saying. I feel like one of the biggest things that I got from doing Kingslayer is I don't have to prove to anybody else that I've climbed something that other people call V13. I can just like wash myself clean of that. And now I can do the thing that will satisfy the other part of my ego, which is find some V13 that's not nearly as cool, but suits my style even better, even if it's like a lowball turd that's like closer to my house and I can like connect to on a physical level. And then I can climb that thing that's like really difficult and satisfies that grade because I want that too. And there's some parts of that in the Kingslayer experience that I actually feel like I didn't get. What I got out of it was climbing like a really badass line, but half of the fun of grade chasing is like you do one and you're like, nah, yeah, I'll take it, and then you get to do the next one where you're like, all right, nobody cares about this one because they think I already did it, but that one was fucking hard.
I love that story you had around pulling over not the lip, but onto the landing of Kingslayer and looking up at it and just, what do you say? Like, that's a boulder problem. Like there's something about that just, if you're listening, that doesn't resonate with you, go out more and find that thing. It could be a sport climb. It could be just get that feeling, because once you have it, I think it changes the way you look at climbing, because you just, all of a sudden you create a tick list in your imaginary tick list. You go, I don't know what that is. I don't know what name that is. I don't know, but that one.
Yeah, I don't think all peak experiences start that way. It's definitely not mandatory, but many of mine have started with some kind of feeling like that for sure.
That's a good point. Like, because it can be quite a mixture of confluence events, and all of a sudden that maybe it is a high ball that you didn't think too highly of, and you're like, whatever, it's not that tough. But again, you get up there and all of your skills are called upon and you have to marshal your forces for that moment. And gosh, it feels good to come out the other side of that. That's an addictive feeling for me. So
definitely.
Well, I do think one of the reasons to climb harder grades is to have access to more of those climbs that you get drawn to. And you teased this earlier about rate limiters. And to me, especially as I get older, and both being older, I have less time. And so I really want more ROI for whatever efforts I do put towards climbing. But also I can't just, as you progress in your climbing career and hopefully get better, like you can't just hope that you get better. Like, I don't know, maybe when you're going from, V0 to V3 or actually quite high up there, kind of just showing up and doing whatever works. But that doesn't work forever, or at least it didn't for me. And so I want to hear more about rate limiters and just kind of how to figure them out for yourself and maybe address them too.
Sure. So rate limiter is just an idea. It's, I guess, self-explanatory, but it's borrowed from computer science. Basically, it's like in any system, what's the choke point that's slowing the system down the most? And if you like remove that choke point, the whole system is going to run faster. And then you can find your next rate limiter, remove that, the whole system runs faster, right? That kind of makes it sound like over optimization. But from a climbing point of view, there can be lots and lots of things that apply to this. So like if you're somebody who wants to climb harder outside, like that's the main thing that you're focused on, probably for a huge percentage of people who are listening to climbing podcasts, the number one rate limiter is just going to be how many days are you going outside per year? And that's the single most important metric that you could make go up, right? So then it becomes a question about your self-identity and your priorities and how much are you willing to change and how much can you actually change? We can get all into all of that stuff. But the question of rate limiters is really about looking at the whole system, not just like how strong are my fingers, how good am I at solving the problem, but like everything, including your recovery and the number of climbing days and like the amount of training you can do in a year and how many competing priorities there are. And just taking a very like impassive look at the entire system from a bird's eye view. And then starting to look at like, okay, this one is the farthest upstream. And if we change that one, that's the one that's going to have the biggest impact on everything else, right? And sort of like narrowing in on what pieces of the puzzle you can look at, because even in 2025, man, like a huge amount of the climbing content that's out there is very focused on like, what are your fingers doing? And even the more heady technical stuff is still like, are your hips close enough to the wall? And it's like, that stuff's great. But if you're climbing outside 25 days a year and you want to climb harder grades, like I actually don't care how strong your fingers are. Like you need to climb outside 2, 3, 4 times as much as that. And if climbing harder is what's really, truly important to you, we got to figure out how to solve that problem.
I often call that majoring in the minors, which I stole from I think it was a weightlifting coach named Dan John. It just always stuck in my head where people get obsessed with the most tiny things and put so much effort in and they haven't zoomed out. And it's like, strong fingers are great, but we have to actually you actually have to even go to a boulder to find out if your fingers are strong enough for it. Well, tell me more about the framework you might use to figure out what someone's rate limiter is. You know, if you're doing an intake with a client or looking at me or yourself, like, yeah, how do you, I don't know if zoom in is the right word, but yeah, identify where to put one's efforts towards.
Yeah, it's hard to distill that system down that I use down to like a very basic sort of thing, because I have a big intake form. It's different with every single person. Usually about the first 30-ish minutes of a 1 hour consult that I do with somebody is going to be me trying to sort of figure out how they tick and how they think about their own problems. I'm going to take all that stuff in the intake and all the video I watched and everything and try to figure out what things I want to talk to them about. Because I almost always have to hear the person talk about it in order to really get into the weeds and like figure out what might be the issue. But there are always some things that stand out a little bit more too. Like really common things that run into with climbers would be like time management skills, their work capacity and their recovery, their stress, like, and I should say my demo is probably mostly 25 to 40, something like that. So this would be different if you were in like the 18 to 25 demo, probably. Fear of falling would be a big one. You know, there are these like, there are maybe like 5 to 10 things that I can kind of recognize pretty quick off the bat, but if the rate limiter is not in that list, then I'm going to need to have a conversation with the person. And in that way, I've like turned myself into not like a GPT, but like a little bit of an algorithm of like, I can't tell you how it works, but I know what all the inputs are. And then after I talk to the person, I'll have an output. Yeah.
And as I said it, I was like, well, it depends on what your motivations are. You know, what do you want to do? And it's on topic, but it's a totally out of left field. You see a lot of clients. And I'm curious, what are people looking for? Is it always just like, I want to climb harder, or is it more narrow where people say, you know, I want better footwork or something? Like, what are people looking for in general?
I get some of all of those things. I would say like the most common answers to why are you hiring a coach are going to be, they either have a specific or a general goal that they're trying to reach. So that could be like, I want to climb this boulder problem or this route. Those are my absolute favorite because it's just way easier to train for one thing than it is to train for everything. And then you have the people who are like, I climb V8, I want to climb V10. That's also super common. Another really common one, I think, because of the demographic that I work with, is people who are like, I actually am progressing. I understand how to train. I just want to train a little bit harder. And I want to take the time that I'm spending on figuring out how to train for climbing and have you do that. And I want to spend that time training. And those are actually some of the best athletes to work with because I can skip a lot of the foo-for-ah and education and stuff and just get right to like helping them actually get a little bit stronger. But all of those cases could be things where the rate limiter might not be what the person expects it to be when they sign up for coaching. And that's just one of the really interesting things about coaching, is that somebody could come to me and they're like, yeah, I really just think that like my fingers are weak and I want my fingers to be like a little bit stronger. And then it turns out they do want to climb outside, and like the number of days they're climbing outside is the most important thing probably, and it's like, yeah, okay, let's train your fingers. Like, hell yeah, I'm psyched on that. I love finger training and I'll help people train their fingers, but also, can we get you to climb 40 days a year instead of 25? Like,
not if you live in Ohio.
It's not easy, man.
Yeah. I mean, I will say I kind of moved my whole life to the mountains to be able to climb outside more. Although it's funny because I don't know if it was actually to climb harder outside as much as it was to honestly have more of those peak experiences, where usually they don't happen indoors. For me, if I was more of a competitor, I can imagine, I mean, when you see people winning a gold medal in the Olympics, or I'm sure those are peak climbing experiences. But just getting outside is always a good goal. Kind of like the next step of that question I have about what people are looking for is this idea of either being your own coach or recognizing what a coach is for. And I used to talk about this when I would do podcasts with Tim, my dude, been a minute, but he was a climbing coach. And this idea of coaches cannot marionette you up a climb. You may work with a coach, you may love a coach, but then just like grades don't matter when you're 20 feet off the deck, your coach isn't there either. You're there on your own. And just how do you talk to clients about that idea of, I'm here to help you actualize your goals, but fundamentally, you're kind of your own being still.
Yeah. You're probably nailing one of the most complicated parts of coaching, and it's different for every person, but you have to figure out what motivates them. Like you asked me, I think in our pre-interview, you were like, if you could only have one question on your intake form, because I told you my intake form is like super long. And that threw me for a loop. I had to think about it. And I was torn between either asking people, what is your goal and why haven't you achieved it yet? Or asking people, what motivates you about climbing? Because if I understand, like truly, if people had to pick one thing, like what motivates them about climbing, it tells me a lot about how we can get them to self-actualize and how we can get them to work towards their goals. Like a lot of climbing coaches sell like 8 and 12 week plans, right? But even in the strength and conditioning literature, there's nothing magical about 8 or 12 weeks. Like 8 or 12 weeks might be where you start to prove that there's some strength adaptation happening. But like most of the stuff that I'm training people on isn't really happening on that timeline. 8 or 12 weeks is long enough to make habit change. And the habit change is where we're going to make actual big gains, right? So my job as a coach is like, how do I motivate this person? What are the most important things that we can get them to do? And how do I get them to get themselves to do it? Because they're probably not going to keep paying me, and they frankly shouldn't keep paying me forever for this information. I just want to like jumpstart them and get them through whatever the thing is that they're on right now. And then if they get stuck again later down the road, they can come back. But like, I'm not trying to turn people into subscriptions. You know what I mean? Like I want to help them with a problem and get them to solve it themselves.
Quick break while I tell you about today's sponsor. You. That's right, you. Thank you to all the patrons who help make this show possible. Join them so you can get episodes early before anyone else, and those episodes are ad-free. As a patron, you also get to submit questions for upcoming guests. The answers to those questions are only available to patrons. Follow the link in the show notes to join now. You also get access to a private Discord where you'll find me and other people who want to go from good to great. Okay, back to the pod. I'll never forget, I was talking to Will Anglin about when he was a coach, and he said he had some kid come up to him and cry and say, why can't you just tell me how to do the climb? And it's like, if I really knew how to get you up the climb, I would. Like, I'm not withholding information. And so, what are some of the foundational habits and self-talk that you've seen be the most successful? Again, I know this is going to depend on each client. What would you say? I really like this one. It was vague advice gets vague results. And with that caveat in mind, the reason why I still am going to push you on it is because there's wisdom to be found in everything you recommend to everyone. Even if I'm not having that problem, often I see where it's coming from and I can learn something from it. And maybe I will have that problem later. And so, I believe that even if you're a V13 climber, you can watch someone climbing V3 and learn something as well. So I'm going to push you a little bit on the habits you've seen be really successful for different clients you've worked with or yourself.
So you said habits and self-talk, which I think, let me try to answer a little more generally because I think there's too much in there. So I'm going to try to give you a general answer. Maybe an example would be helpful. So if you ever work with a coach and they're spending more time talking than listening, that's not a great sign. And probably the best of all the W questions that a coach can ask is why. So like a recent example is I had an in-person coaching session with somebody and she tried to flash this boulder and then she didn't, she fell off the top. And I was like, what are you going to do next? And she's like, oh, I'm going to like try the top. And then I wasn't really sure about the bottom. So I'm going to like try these moves in the bottom again. And I was like, well, okay, like what weren't you sure about in the bottom? We talked about that. And I was like, why are you going to try it so many more times? If you had the confidence to flash it originally, like what's different about that versus now, other than you quote, can't flash anymore? And it like really stunned her a little bit. I think she just sort of was going straight into red point mode after she didn't flash. But I didn't need to tell her what to do or to give her any tactics or anything like that. I just needed to like basically get her to check herself and say like, wait a second, if I had the confidence to do this on my first try, why do I need to spend 20 minutes like trying all these other moves before I try it on my, like I can apply the same confidence that I had on my second try. She didn't do it on her second try. She had to work some other stuff out too, but I still think it's a useful lesson.
I'm actually laughing because I just thought this is the perfect place for the soft second go meme that would just been perfect there. Yes. So the reason why I lumped the self-talk and habits in is that I think that a tool I've used in the past is that I recognize negative habits I have, and I'll often have some kind of phrase or I don't know, mantra is not the right word there, more like a corrective phrase. And then it kind of builds a new habit, not even a new habit. It's almost like I get into that situation and now I say the same thing to myself and now I have like some action. And the one I often use is that I get scared on sport climbing, which is embarrassing considering how much eyeballs I've done. And it's maybe not crippling fear, but I get scared.
Negative self-talk.
Well, so I'll be up there. I get scared. And then what I do is I know that as I get scared, I get more in my hands. I get tighter in my shoulders. I take weight off of my feet. And also I often move a little more timidly. So basically, as soon as I feel myself doing that, I often tell myself, relax, like overemphasize weight on your feet. And then so it becomes this kind of tighter loop where I still get scared, but I know what to say. And then I automatically do it. And so that's why I link the idea of habit and self-talk together.
I think that's great. I mean, so maybe this is useful context, but like my way of thinking about climbing progression, and this is, I think, helpful for the whole rate limiter conversation, is like when I talk about the system and looking at the system from a bird's eye view, my mental framework for that is I have this pyramid, and people could probably Google like Jesse Firestone non-physical factors or something like that, and it'll come up. But it's basically your strength is like the last thing of the pyramid that happens right before you climb. And then you have your tactics, your technique, your emotional self-regulation, your logistical skills, and then your identity. And the identity is the base. And the reason the identity is the base is because if you have a strong enough identity inside climbing and you want it bad enough, that's really what I think of as wanting it, is like you identify very strongly with the goal. You can solve problems at any other level. Really, like any lower level can solve problems with the levels above it. So if you have a strong identity, you can solve a strength problem. If you have really good emotional regulation, you might be able to solve a strength problem, things like that, right? And like, if you can figure out what layer your rate limiter is at, that'll kind of tell you how big of a deal it is. And self-talk is identity. So if you want to know what your climbing identity is like, don't just think that it's what's in your head. Listen to what you actually say about yourself and about your climbing out loud. Because like, I would think that I have a very strong identity as a climber and a coach, and I do, but I do the same thing that you just did, especially with sport climbing, where I go like, oh, I'm being a big fucking baby up here. And then I'm like, wait a second, what about that strong identity that I thought I had? I need to change the way that I talk about myself as a sport climber. And that's actually something I'm working on right now, which is why I brought it up.
Well, yeah. What are some of the tools to help change that identity? When you hear something inside that you don't like, or you don't feel like represents who you are, who you want to be, how do you go about changing that?
So you could go read about cognitive behavioral therapy, which I think is the actual way to do that. But I think for most people, it probably starts with just as simple as noticing when you say something negative about your climbing or something negative about the challenge that you're about to take on. And if you can just work on noticing it, the next pieces of the loop, which is basically the loop that you were referring to, are going to be a lot more productive. So like for me, the first couple of times I went sport climbing this year, I was being a baby, and I am not embarrassed about that anymore because it's freaking scary when you haven't done it in a while. But at the time I was like super hard on myself because my memory of being a sport climber was like being up there, run out at Smith Rock and just feeling like great and not having a problem at all. And I was like shocked to find that when I didn't sport climb for a whole bunch of years, that did not persist, And once I kind of got over the initial shock of not being as good at it as I thought, and like reflecting a little bit away from climbing and being like, well, how do I want to approach it? How do I want to talk to myself? I just was a lot more self-compassionate. And I think that helped a lot with that specific scenario. But it really starts with just hearing what you're saying to yourself and hearing the way you're treating yourself. You may have heard this before on your podcast or on a different one, but just imagine that the things you were saying about your own climbing were things that you were saying about someone else's climbing. Like if you said that someone else was scared and that was embarrassing, like that'd be a fucked up thing to say to somebody else, but you have no problem saying it about yourself.
Just calling out your friend, like, why are you even scared up there? It's interesting because one of the ways I start that loop is you have to be honest with yourself. So I like that hearing what is going on. So you have to actually hear it and be honest. And I think to me, the important part of that is then being able to give yourself kind of graded exposure to whatever the thing is. So if you just tell yourself like, you're not scared, you're just being a baby, I'm just going to go do this crazy run out, dangerous X, 513X, and just toss yourself in the deep end. Well, you might make it out, but you probably won't. And it does strike me that the mantra or whatever self-talk I gave myself was not just the key. Like it was part of acknowledging where I was and what I needed to expose myself to so that I could build that loop in. Cause if the loop was too big and too scary, it wasn't going to work.
Yeah. Really hard climbing is largely about self-efficacy and self-mastery. And with all self-mastery, you have to have honesty. Like professional basketball players or tennis players are not going out on that court like the other team sucks, we're going to whoop their ass. Like maybe there's some element of that, but I think for the most part, like they know that they're going to have to fight for every point. And it's like the same in climbing. The hardest high balls that I did, I was not like visualizing them as if they were on the ground and low balls, like, and it was going to be totally safe and fine. I was like gripped and I continued doing the visualization until it wasn't scary in my mind anymore. But I still knew that there were consequences when I pulled off the ground. Like otherwise you're just setting yourself up for a really negative experience.
Whenever we talk about visualization, I always remember what Katie Lamb said to me. And it was this idea that when she visualizes, she will still sometimes fall in her visualization, and that she repeats visualization until she doesn't fall. And I just thought 100%. That was so cool. Like just this idea of, I don't even know if like we use the word visualization, but to me that was almost like running a test, like actually climbing it in her mind. And if you always send and crush, just like if you always are like, I'm going to step onto the court and I'm going to beat whoever it is, always, it's like, maybe you're not actually doing anything useful here because you're not acknowledging the reality of the situation that's in front of you.
Yeah. Dude, all motor imagery research fundamentally comes from this guy. I forget his name, but it was his model for self-efficacy. And the whole idea behind motor imagery is you're increasing your level of mastery by performing reps without having to actually embark on whatever the physical challenge is that you're undertaking. So it could be something simple like a hand grip dynamometer. It could be like playing a piano. It can be a climbing sequence. And with any of those things, like if you're not doing it the way that you want to do it in your mind, that's the whole point of the practice, is to increase your mastery by getting more reps at the thing without having to like fuck up your skin or your tendons or whatever it is, right? That's what it's all about.
I got to shout out this book that I read called The Art of Learning by Joshua Waitskins. Oh,
yeah, it's a great book.
So good. The part that you made me think about was, well, so the little context is he was an amazing chess prodigy, and then he went on to also be amazing at Tai Chi push hands, which is a martial art. And I don't want to spoil the ending there, but the part I'm thinking of is when he broke his hand or arm not too long before that World Cup match, and he was in a cast, and he visualized exercising the arm often. And he say really focused on it, really, tried to do the reps, and that when he took off the cast, he had not lost the muscle and ability like he expected, or like a normal person would. And I don't know all the details there. Maybe he's fudging the truth a little bit, but there's definitely something to performance in your mind and connecting your body to it that typically results in a better outcome in the quote unquote real world.
I mean, if you want to talk about the idea of rate limiters, if you can only practice climbing or do climbing moves by actually having to pull onto the wall, you're always going to be doing less practice than somebody who can do the climbing in their mind. Again, there are like genetic factors. Some people are better at motor imagery than other people, but it just means that it's something that some people may have a harder time with. Doesn't mean that they should experiment with it and try to get good at it. And practicing visualization, it's not easy. People who are maybe newer to it or newer to climbing may think that it's like something that is just, you can do it or you can't do it. But like, for me, it was born of, I was just like so psyched on my projects that I was thinking about them all the time. And it kind of morphed into this other thing. But like over the years, I've put in so many reps in order to get good at it. And like, if you visualize hesitation, you will hesitate. If you visualize fear, you will be afraid. It just takes a lot of practice to get to the point where you can get those things out of your mind a little bit.
This makes me think that video and video analysis, it's a relatively new thing in our sport. I don't know, within the last 10 years or 15 years, really, really within the last 5 years, I think people are leaning into it in a way that they haven't before. And I wonder how that's connected. Like there's something about this ability to review our attempts and, learn from the video rather than just always pulling on. And I know that's not the same thing as visualization, but there's some similarities there.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's like probably the same as like having a map on your phone can either make you way better at knowing your way around, or it can make you an absolute buffoon who has no idea where anything is. It just entirely depends on how you use the tool. So as I'm working a route, especially, I do this more for routes than for boulder problems. I'll edit together from my footage. I'll like film the route and I'll edit together the sequence as I know it. And I'll watch the sequence as I know it before I do my visualization practice to just kind of like get it all into my mind and the nuances of where I am on the route and what things look like. And that's something that I didn't do 10 years ago, but it's just a little bit of a visual aid. So like could make the practice better if you use the tool, right?
Well, first of all, I love that idea of tools can either be like a crutch or a bicycle. Is that a good analogy? Either you can like have them make you worse or they can help you to really excel. And that's interesting doing it on a route. I'm not a huge sport climber, despite deep love for it. And I hadn't thought about using it on sport climbs as much. To me, bouldering, it's always like, oh, like my foot was actually on that spike a little to the left. Like I remembered that totally wrong. And look, my knee subtly dropped. I think it's really important to really feel in your body what's going on. Sometimes I'm wrong. And I'm better than most, probably because I've paid attention for many, many years, but I still get it wrong sometimes what I think I'm doing and what I'm actually doing.
Yeah. Can I geek out? Do you want to go into a little?
Please,
deep?
Please.
Okay.
I beg of you.
So the reason that I'm videoing the routes, even though the routes are tall and I can't even see everything that's happening, is that when I'm bouldering, I don't even use first or third person visualization. I use what I call tactile visualization. I feel like I'm giving away some of my intellectual property here because I don't think this exists anywhere, but it's what you said. It's how it feels. So like tactile visualization is like, I'm entirely focused on like the sensations of the friction under my fingers, the way that my muscles feel, where I can breathe in my body, where the tension is, where the lightness is. It's entirely a felt thing. And I actually didn't know that that was the main way I was practicing visualization until I was way down into it. And actually I'd started coaching and I started like learning about the different types of research because this doesn't really exist in the research. It's all first or third person. So you're actually seeing from your POV or you're seeing from the third person, your body climbing. I don't really do that so much. I mostly do this tactile thing where I'm like, how does it feel? What are my fingers on? Like, where are the grains? But for route climbing, especially longer, more complex routes, I guess it's even a little bit laziness, but it's also just efficiency. Like I don't need to visualize this every tiny little micro detail of every little foot spike for the entire route, because visualizing the route is going to take 7 minutes when I could just visualize a lightness and a freedom and a flow for this like 512 section. And then I get to the crux and I go into the like micro detailed tactile visualization. And then I zoom back out to the kind of third person view of like, yeah, I'm surfing across this rail and I throw my heel up, paddle through some stuff, make a clip. Okay, now I'm back into the tricky bit again. And I need to go like move by move with the tactile visualization again. That's what the video is for, is I can kind of just remember what the route looks like and like just visualize a feeling for those sections where I don't need to be quite as detailed. Whereas with the boulder, like I could still tell you every single nuance of how I did Kingslayer, for instance.
Really cool, this idea of utilizing different points of view all the way from third, first, and I don't know, fingertip or tactile, like deep feelings, for appropriate parts of the boulder or route. Like, I think that's an interesting concept of recognizing that you don't need to necessarily know exactly that start foot because, I don't know, you're about to embark on a 100-foot route. Like, who cares? That just kind of strikes me as being an interesting way to do visualization, is to recognize the importance, or even not always just the importance, but what's the best tool to use for whatever section you're struggling with, because it's not always the crux. Sometimes it's like a different part, and just the idea of I visualize flowing through that 512 section.
For one of the hardest highballs, probably the hardest highball I've done, there's like 2 foot cuts in a row. And I was visualizing the air under my feet. Like I knew the moves so well, and I had done the moves so many times on the head wall on a rope that I didn't need to visualize the thing, but I was afraid of, it sounds kind of silly actually, but I was afraid that I would be in the middle of those foot cuts and I just wouldn't try hard enough. And I was afraid of falling like that, because when you're in this roof, and like if you swing out really hard and you don't try hard to hold on, like you're going to take a weird fall with angular momentum. And like I didn't know where I would land on the pads or if I would land on the pads. And I was literally just like, just feel the feeling of like when you swing out, you have all this clean space below you, and like don't let go. And that was my visualization for that section.
Yeah, it's weird how I talked to Alex Honnold about this too, where like he feels fear, and when you see people doing scary things, they're not feeling fear. And it's interesting, this idea of you practicing the fear. Like, okay, I'm going to feel it, and this is what I want to do with it. Not like I'm going to not feel it, I'm going to banish it, but this is how it's going to show itself, and here's how I want to, I don't know if channel is even the right word, but embrace it versus like, who knows what's going to happen? I just hope that I don't get scared or something. That doesn't seem realistic to me.
Yeah. We're humans. We habituate to things, and it's not always going to be perfectly accurate. You're not always going to know exactly what the experience is going to be like, but if you can get in the right ballpark, then you'll habituate yourself a little bit, and the emotions will be like a little bit more under control than they would be if it was just a totally left field experience. Like, what's really impressive about somebody like Alex is he can go on site free solo like a 511 or a 512, and he has so much experience that he still is in control in those situations. And I don't know what his visualization practice is like. I'm not sure that he does any at all, but if I was going to try to have that sort of experience, I would be visualizing the feeling of lightness and the sensation of freedom and the feeling of control and safety and security, even not knowing like what kind of moves I would be doing, just because I think that would increase my chances of success, which in that case would be survival.
Oh man, dude, when you say that stuff, I just think about those images of him on El Cap and just the air. Oh, I mean, even the high balls that we've risked our ankles on, there's some joy of mixing like the fear and the power and control all into one. And I think that's why that peak experience seems to happen more often, for me at least, when there's a touch of danger, because it's pushing my abilities in more than one dimension than just difficulty. And you're just more likely to have it versus just one single dimension. And, everything is perfect on this day physically. It's like, well, how often does that happen? And how do you set that up versus a confluence of things? So,
yeah, I didn't think about this until we got here in the conversation, but actually a rate limiter in my climbing that kind of sums up a lot of the things that we're talking about is the whole reason I moved to Washington is because living in Bend, where I was at the time, I had sort of run out of like pure difficulty climbing to do for bouldering. Like I could sport climb at Smith. Pushing myself at Smith isn't as exciting for me. I don't love the style enough. And I had done like a lot of the pure difficulty boulders. So I was just finding these high balls and putting up these high balls. And that was really interesting and challenging. And I'm super glad I had the experiences I did. But I sort of realized like it's taking me like 15 climbing days to do each one of these projects. And that's just not, first of all, they're not physically at my limit, because if they were, it'd be way too scary and dangerous. And I wanted more physical difficulty. And second of all, taking 15 days to do every project was just like a very slow pace. I didn't feel like my climbing was like progressing that much. So in a sense, like the rate limiter was that I was out of physically hard enough climbing to do, or that the climbing I was doing was just too scary for me to be efficient at it.
Amazing humble brag there, Jesse. Just not enough hard boulders. No, all I have was Smith Rock in my backyard. And screw that.
There's some young guns who are putting up new stuff. So if I moved back, I think there would be a few things to do now.
Before we move on, I just want to say, is there anything else around video analysis? Basically, Jesse, I want to put you out of a job. I want you to share all of your tricks about how you might approach something like video analysis, because it is a tool that I'm no expert at it. I just will look at my videos and try to pick out some things, but I think it's something that, again, is a way for you to coach yourself. And I wonder if there's any tips or tricks you can pass along to people who are reviewing their own footage that, a coach's eye on it.
Yeah. I don't think I can quickly explain how to do what I do with people, but I will say that I think it's like speaking a language, in that you have to be exposed to it and you have to spend a lot of time with it. And then you'll develop an appreciation for the grammar and stuff, even if you don't know how to write the words down on paper and you don't know why the grammar works that way. So the single most important thing is to just keep engaging with it. And like, when I started coaching, and like before I was a paid coach or whatever, but when I started like working with people and trying to help them with their climbing just for fun, I was much more interested in like, oh, don't do this, or like do more of that, or like you're not doing this enough. Nowadays, it's much more principle based and much more like, what are the reasons that you're moving the way that you are? And now I would say I've even progressed beyond that. And it's more just like, what are the things that you're reaching for over and over that your body likes to do? And are those good things or bad things? And like, what are the downstream effects of those things happening? And like, I think it takes a long time to go through that whole arc of understanding. And I have to go through it with every client, basically. But if people start that process and they just start noticing, like, why do I kick my feet out to the side when I do a dynamic move with the opposite hand? Like, is it because my body's built that way? Or is it because something else is happening in my body that's weird? Is it an effective strategy for me? Should I even try to do anything about it? Because maybe it's not a bad thing, but it's just like, what are the things that you're doing over and over? What are you reaching for? And that's an effective start, I think, for most people. And that's definitely something that a coach would probably jumpstart people too.
Yeah, I just want to be clear. I was joking, Jesse. You're an amazing coach. I encourage people to work with coaches, no matter how good they think they are. And honestly, it can be really fun. And you think you know yourself, and you don't. It's tough to coach yourself, and the best way to do it is to have a coach help direct you. And then you learn things about yourself, and then you check back. And I love what you said earlier around, it's not that you necessarily want to work with people forever and that they need you, but that you can help them create a toolbox that lets them actualize on their own. And to be honest, man, like that probably makes people want to come back to you after they've left you and said, hey, I have a new plateau, a new barrier. I don't know. Maybe I need to add a tool to my toolbox. So I wanted to be explicit that I told you before, like I love coaching, or when I say that, I mean, I love being coached, and they're some of the most important people in my life when I look back: climbing, gymnastics, swimming. And so, yeah, thanks for doing that.
I'm clear-eyed about it, man. I don't think everybody needs a coach all the time, for sure. Like, it's not for a lot of people. I'm not the right coach for a lot of people. I think coaches who think that, their program is the right program for everybody and they're the right coach for everybody, that's just asinine. Like, and they know it. But you'll never find out if somebody's the right coach for you if you don't try working with them. And I am the right coach for some people. So
that whole thing about finding the right coach is actually really, really important. It made me think of why I actually started climbing. I was a gymnast. I loved my coach, really loved him. And then he graduated from graduate school or whatever. He had to leave. He was no longer a coach. My whole group tried to move to a new coach, and it just didn't quite work. And I think you build up this trust with, it can be the people around you, not always just a coach, but in certain sports, you really need a coach who can show you the way. And you often reach this level where you lean on those around you to recognize if you're ready for the next level. So if your buddy was next to you and saying like, hey, Jesse, like you didn't look good on that high ball. Like, I don't think you should go for it. Probably listen to them. And it was like that in gymnastics where it's like, look, Josh, I can't really spot you on this double backflip, but you're ready and you need to commit, like not kind of half-ass it because that's how you get hurt in climbing too. You need to actually go for it, and having that trust in someone to tell you when you're ready and then believe in them enough to commit yourself is invaluable.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, I've had several coaching relationships where the person wants to bite off more than they can chew, or like, they have some grand idea, but they're just not sure that they're capable of it. And frankly, like if I work with somebody for like 8 weeks, it's not going to be enough time for me to authoritatively like make a difference to them and be like, dude, you can fucking do this. But some of the longest and most fruitful coaching relationships I've had, it's like you almost get to the end of it and you're like, look, man, I'm taking the training wheels off. Like you need to go try to climb V13 now. Stop training, stop fucking around, move into your van, like go give it an honest effort. You know what I mean? Like that sometimes is the productive endpoint of the coaching relationship, is to be like, okay, yeah, go.
People are often more capable than they realize. And I think about this one woman who climbed Better Eat Your Wheaties, which is this V8 in Waco. And I think it was the first of her grade, and she was really psyched. And I was like, good job. But like you did it in like 4 goes. Like, I'm not saying like not good job, but don't get too hung up there, because the lesson you should have taken from that is not that like, wow, you're great, you can climb V8, but that you should expect more. I think that was like her life goal too. It's like, maybe we should reassess there.
Yeah. Yeah. Earlier when you were talking about, or when we were talking about peak experiences and you were relating it to grades, and I was thinking like, it has something to do with that feeling of like when you really, really want to climb something, you think it looks super cool. You're just like so psyched and you think it's going to be a peak experience. And then you like show up on the trip or whatever, and you do it in like 3 tries, and there's like a hollowness to it. You're just kind of like, that wasn't quite like what I wanted out of that experience, actually. Like, damn. And it's like so funny that you could climb like a life lister and be like disappointed with yourself. But yeah, sometimes there's more to give.
I've had that sadness when I travel and you've seen a cool picture of something and you show up and you're like, oh, they must have taken that picture from a very good angle, because this climb does not look near as cool as I thought it was.
Yeah. The Oregon effect, we call that in Oregon.
You know, I was thinking about when we were talking about those intimidating ones that just kind of get you, is I was up in Squamish. Have you bouldered much in Squamish?
Oh yeah. It's my favorite climbing place in the world, dude.
I assume that you would, just based on your location, and this is a long freaking time ago, but we called this day the Highball Hoedown, and we were in camp, we were camping, and we kind of like put out the word like, oh, tomorrow we're going to do some highballs. And we wanted to hit like kind of all the famous highballs, and the logistics of actually making it to all of them were difficult. So the day before we walked them, we were like, okay, like what's the order we're going to do it? And I just remember coming up on Teenage Lobotomy, and it's a V6 or V7. And I don't know if I'm experienced highball or at that point, whatever. I climbed plenty of highballs, and I just remember like, ooh, like, I don't know about that one. And then that night, that's what I'm thinking about, like as I go to sleep. And it was quite a moment when I did that. And, for me, like there's that kind of connection of getting drawn to something, and, closing the loop the next day was just, I had to say it because I couldn't get out of my head after we were talking about it.
Not Teenage Lobotomy, but there's a climb in Squamish called Zero to Hero. You know that boulder?
I don't, but now I'll go check out next time.
Power lines. It's not in the main area, but it's a V4. It's probably 25 or 30 feet tall. It's like very, very tall boulder and overhanging. And that's one of my peak experiences in climbing for sure. I did a ground up first try, and like, it's quote only V4, but yeah, I had a real experience of mastery and like flow on that for sure.
Yeah. Again, isn't that so interesting to people? You're talking about the V13 you just did, and you're like, yeah, that V4 though. And by the way, actually, now that I think about that trip, I had climbed hard boulders on that trip right before. And I remember going out and seeing, I want to say it was Enchanted or something, maybe like.
Oh yeah.
And we didn't do it. Like we looked at it and we looked at the top and we were just like, that looks sketchy. I mean, it was been ground up, and just backed off, just said, not for us. And I don't know, it tells you again about climbing and peak experiences and what we're all seeking when you compare. Yeah, it's why each climb has a name too. And like when I said teenage lobotomy, you're like, oh yeah, that one, not that one V6, like you're like, no, that one.
I know the one. Yeah, one of the best highballs in the world.
Oh, it's so good. Okay, I don't know how to segue this, but I still think it's an interesting topic. Jesse, my little tagline is, how do you go from good to great? And I will ask you that. This is not the question, just preparing you for it.
Okay.
Thank you for pulling it up, though, your answer. But like I said, you've trained people that are V0, V6, V16, and I'm curious what the differences are, if any, when you talk to someone who is an elite climber, or I don't know, elite. Well, I don't know. I want to throw out that word. A very, very high level climber. And, is there anything different about training someone who's V6 versus getting their first V16?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, there has to be. Obviously, everybody that's climbed V16 at some point was somebody who climbed V6, but probably they weren't training at that point. They were probably still just climbing. But the big difference between training people who are at those different calibers is, I think it's just almost definitely going to be work capacity and their ability to tolerate the physical strain of climbing. There's going to be other things. If somebody's climbing V16, they probably are outliers in terms of like their ability to remain focused for a really long session. And maybe they have some motor imagery outliers and stuff we were talking about earlier. But yeah, the biggest thing is just the physical work capacity. And the reason that really matters is because if you're trying to get better at V6 and you don't have a lot of time to work with, you have to focus on the right stuff. But if you had the work capacity of someone who is climbing V16 and you're trying to climb V6, you just fucking climb way more and you're going to get better. And you don't need to focus on the right things because you're throwing enough at the problem that it's going to work, right? I think that's why my demographic is interesting. The people that I tend to work with, I work with people of all calibers and all ages. By the way, I'm just saying the area that I have the most experience. Those people tend to be time poor. And I work with a lot of just adults who have kids and jobs and stuff. And it's a little more complicated to make sure that you're focusing on the right things. So yeah, it's totally different between those two camps, but largely just because if you're a V16 type climber, you're going to have a lot more time. That's probably a lot of how you got to that place, honestly.
It's interesting. I mean, of course, it's not interesting that they have more work capacity when they're a V16 climber. It's actually one of the things that Daniel Woods is famous for, even among other V16 or V17 climbers, is that he just can keep going and going. His nickname is Diesel, and yeah, let your mind go with that one. But I was kind of surprised to hear that in some ways, because when I think about what it's like for me to climb my hardest grades versus when I was maybe climbing much lower grades, I feel like I have less shots on goal. Like I can only pull on, V13 so many times versus like a V3. And even when I was a V3 climber, I would say, you think you're trying hard, you're not trying as hard as someone who's climbing V16.
Well, you're trying hard in a very, like when I was climbing V3, it was like, I was trying really hard, but in such a scattered way. It was just like almost aimless effort being at the gym for 3 hours, but like trying different beta on every try, and like, gosh, I have a specific memory of like projecting, I think it was V3 in the gym. And like, I would not take a rest day, but I would show up to the gym and just get myself all ready and chalked up and just immediately try the problem that I was trying. Warm up of any kind, you can get away with that stuff when you're only trying those easy grades. It's like total scattershot approach. Basically, it doesn't matter that much yet.
I just love that, like just showing up and like you just bang your head against the wall in the same climb for, you say 3 hours, it could have been like 6 hours. Like when I was young and you just climb forever and you're tired and your skin is ragged. And actually, I still will recommend people do this. I've pushed back on there's some memes maybe out there about like you only get better when you're resting and this. And I don't want to say that resting and recovery is important. As a guy who's 39, I put a lot of effort into resting and recovery. I'm very, very aware of it, unfortunately. But I think if you look back on anyone in their starting career, they climbed a lot, and you need to earn the not earn the recovery, but just this idea of if someone tries 110% on a V3, they actually don't need as much recovery as someone who tries 110% on a V17, I would argue.
Yeah, I think there's probably some truth to that. I would say that one thing that we do know from strength and conditioning science is that your power output does really matter for being coordinated. And when you're tired, you're just not going to produce as much power. So like, yeah, a really elite athlete is going to be able to sustain high power output for longer, and they're going to probably bounce back a little bit faster in order to produce a high power output. And you also can't get that way without doing some training that's like that. Like if you never train at high capacity, you're not going to have a high capacity, right? So like there's a little bit of this stuff that's like self-referential. But as far as like a V3 climber getting more tired, if you're not doing the same thing on every try, and if you're not resting enough between the tries and stuff, you're getting a very general adaptation. Whereas like an elite person is going to be hopefully trying a very specific thing at a very high power output. They're going to be very coordinated. You know, it's like, and at that point, like the difference between 98% power output and 99% power output starts to become like pretty meaningful, even though those people also have an advantage in terms of like how fast they can turn around to get that same like level of power output. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but
it does. I guess what I mean is that let's just do weightlifting since it's super simple. If you take someone who is trying to do a squat for a gold medal and it'd be powerlifting then, but yeah, we'll just say powerlifting, and they squat like 1,200 pounds, they tap into something in their nervous system deeply that may require them to recover for a true 1 rep max. It could be 2 weeks or something or I don't know, or a month, like
months.
Yeah, months really. And I just think that, in fact, I'd use that word, the lack of coordination, which is something I would argue is actually inherent in strength deeply, is not there on someone squatting 100 pounds. Just, they can subjectively try maybe even harder, but they can't access as many motor units. That coordination piece. So that's kind of what I mean, but we're like off in the weeds, but I put that out there. I don't know.
Yeah. I think there's some value in tying things back to powerlifting for some of that stuff. I do think just in general, bouldering especially is like, it's so high velocity. It's such higher power output than squat, bench, and deadlift are. Squat, bench, and deadlift, you might get more total recruitment, but like in terms of the speed of the movement in climbing, it's just like way, way, way faster. And so you need a much higher degree of coordination. And so being well rested is important when the moves are really fast and hard for you, which they seem relatively fast and hard to a V3 climber doing a V3, but they're not actually that fast yet. But V16, yeah, it's pretty much always like pretty fast.
So this is always a huge debate, is that as you get more tired, you lose coordination, and you don't want junk reps necessarily where you feel like crap, but you're still trying your project. And then maybe you're ingraining like weird movement patterns that you wouldn't have on your send go. Like, how do you know when to pull the plug on? I mean, you could say training for power. I mean, that would be kind of like the way to say it, but yeah, like when should you back off?
So my general advice, and like what I would put on Instagram for the average person that's reading it, is going to be like, when you feel like your power is dropping and you're not latching, if you're just a normal person who climbs for fun, probably you want to just end the session. If you're climbing on the moon board and you've done the opening move 5 times, and the 6th time you try it, you don't latch the hold, and the 7th time you try it, you don't latch the hold, and you're like, oh, I feel like I was on the hold, like I'd probably end the session. Not necessarily because there is nothing else that could be gained from that session. There are still things that could be gained, but just for a normal person, you've probably gone from 99% power down to like 98 or 97 or 95 or whatever. But for most of us, it's a higher risk. And the biggest threat to long-term progression for the average person is just getting hurt. That's the thing that messes you up. So from that matter, it's like, could you send your moonboard problem at 95% power? Yeah, fucking of course. We all did that when we started climbing. We all sent our projects when we were super down in the fatigue hole. But that doesn't mean it's like a good idea. I think that's where the work capacity of elite climbers becomes really relevant, is that yes, they can send their project at 95% power output. They're also just less likely to get hurt because they probably are going to have slightly better genetics.
Those bastards. I will say, so here's one of the reasons why I bring this up, is that I was heavily influenced by Dave McLeod's book, 9 out of 10 climbers make the same mistakes. And one of the mistakes or whatever was that pros try their projects one more time than you do. And that thing I talked about earlier, where when I know I can do something, I typically do execute it in that day. And one of the ways I do that is by trying again and again. Then my rest periods get longer. I'm like, okay, I gotta set a timer for 30 minutes, but I'm going to really try hard. I've also injured myself like that, Jesse.
Yeah, me too, man. I mean, I hate to say it, and this relates to some of the stuff I went through before Kingslayer, but like, I'm not the healthiest 38-year-old. I have some stuff that works against me. I am what you would call injury prone. I have weird collagen. I don't know exactly what the deal is, but I get a lot of soft tissue injuries, and I have just as many experiences where that fourth go on a route, I sent it. As I do that fourth go on a route, I tweaked something, or whatever, 15th try on a boulder problem or whatever. I have like just as many good as bad experiences. So in the moment, it really just comes down to like, how bad do I want this? And can I come back in 3 days or whatever? And if I'm in Rocklands, like, I'm going to hang it out there and try to fucking do it, But if I'm home and I can come back next Saturday, I just pack it up.
Yeah, I think that's also how I kind of squared that idea is, well, do you really want to do this boulder route? Like, I mean, did you travel around the world to do this? Because yeah, it would suck to get injured, but there's a good chance I'll never be back in Turkey for that climb. And so I am going to hang it out. I don't know. It's a hard one lesson because I don't know. I like trying hard. I think there's two kinds of people. There's people you have to push and there's people you have to pull back.
Yes.
And I would argue that a lot of my audience is the people you have to pull back because, I mean, it's like, yeah, I heard you, Jesse. I didn't latch out my 6th and 7th time. I still want to do the fucking boulder. Like,
yeah, totally.
I don't care,
The vast majority of people that I work with, I spend more time trying to constrain their volume than pushing them to do more. There are some people who are on the other side, but it's like relatively rare. It's way more common that I'll talk to somebody who'll be like, so I had it a 5th climbing day, and you're just kind of like, it's okay, man. You don't need to be like shamed. Like, it's fine. Did you hurt yourself? No? Okay, then we're good. If you hurt yourself, then I'm going to whack you on the knuckles,
Oh, I wish I could have a 5th climbing day in my life. I like that word, time poor. That's something that I encourage people who are on that. You told me your spectrum of your athlete ages, and something that I actually remember reading this from Dan John. Again, he was a strength and conditioning coach, and something he argued about people who are on the older end of the spectrum is that you should spend your money on your sport because that's often something that you have that you didn't have when you were 18 and your time poor, but get a coach, get a new, chalk bag. I don't know, whatever, like go on that trip. Like that is something you can do. And, if you're going to be time poor and I don't know, hopefully, you make a few bucks more when you're 40 than when you were 14. Yeah. Spend it on the
build a wall in your garage. If you have a garage and you can afford it.
There you go. I've got one. That's as soon as I got a kid, I put a wall in my garage. Okay, Jesse, now I'm going to ask you that question. You can pull it up. I heard you pulling it up. And we've gone over a bunch of these, though, so I don't know. I'm curious to see what this brings out. And Jesse, how do you go from good to great?
Yeah, so I don't think it'll be a huge surprise to anybody, but I'll preamble first. I've listened to a good chunk of Testpiece podcasts, and I think what's cool about climbing and what's cool about this question is like there are so many different answers to it, and a lot of them are right for different people, and a lot of them are probably right for different people at different times. But I'll tell you the thing that has personally made the biggest impact in my climbing, and it's what's led to the most peak experiences. So that's how I'm going to choose to interpret the question. You threw a V grade on the good to great thing, which I really appreciated because that helps contextualize it for me. Happens to be a V grade that I've climbed. And like what really helped me get over the biggest plateaus for me is to just identify very strongly with whatever the goal is. And if the goal is to get better at climbing, identify strongly with that goal. And that can mean a lot of different things. But if you have that strong self-identity of like, I want to be the kind of person who can climb this thing, or I want to be the kind of person who's like nonstop getting better at climbing, even though I'm 38, I own a business, I'm having a kid, I've got a decrepit ancient dog that I got to take care of, I have a number of musculoskeletal sidebars that are frustrating, but I want to be the kind of person who's still getting better. And if you have that strong self-identity, you can work backwards and solve like almost any other problem, because true radical progression comes from radical self-change. And you just can't initiate that process if you don't believe strongly in who you are. And I think actually a lot of the other good answers to this question that I've heard people say on the podcast also come from the fact that they have a strong identity in climbing. So that's my meta answer.
That's a good one, man. Congrats on the upcoming kid, by the way. It's going to ruin your climbing, but congrats.
No, it's going to make my climbing even better.
I just can't. Yes, I swear that's the case. Talk about recovery and sleep. No, it's interesting to really trace it down to that identity and motivation, because I think it really does link up with everything we talked about. And it's also why, Jesse, we bonded over intimidating highballs, right? Like in these peak experiences and everything. But this is why I'm always careful to also say that if you want to board climb, if you want to just indoor climb, whatever you fall in love with, like, good for you. Love is a wonderful thing. And I'm right there to support and to spot you. And I think tracing it down to that is just super important, man. So that's congruent with everything you said. And I also think it's interesting how you talked about all of these factors that potentially can hold you back, but at the end of the day, like, you just have to, talk about that foundation that keeps you going forward and like what you really want. And it makes me think of, I had a shoulder injury. I've had a lot of specific shoulder injuries, surgery, all sorts of fun stuff. And I had one recently, or, within the last 3 years that, I don't know, I was just like, why me? Like, that's enough, man. Like, and I came to a moment where I was like, okay, dude, do you want to quit climbing? Cause you can just quit. Like, no one's forcing you. And I was like, oh, I don't want to quit. Okay. Well, it kind of like resolved itself in the sense of, okay, well, if you're not going to quit, then this is just another bump in the road. This is, just, yes, you have to wake up and take care of your 3-month-old at night, but that doesn't really mean you can't go climb the next day. It's just, are you in it or are you not?
Yeah, dude, hell yeah. The injury thing is one thing, but like, to take the more positive flip side, like you mentioned the power of that feeling of like when I mentioned pulling over the lip and like seeing Kingslayer, and like there's a bunch of other lines that have given me that feeling, like some of those high balls in Bend. Like I remembered standing on that and being like, there's a line here. I can see the holds from the ground. And like, yeah, maybe like somebody, Jason Kale could do this, or like some traveling climber from Bishop or something could do this. And then like whatever, 9 years later or something, I'm like head pointing it and like really close to doing it. And I'm standing at the base and I'm like, I have turned myself into the person that I thought I wasn't by just relentlessly trying to get a tiny bit better without stopping. And it's crazy the amount of progress you can make in like 9, 10, 15, 30 years. Just gotta like not stop if you really believe in yourself.
All right, I'm just gonna let that hang there. That was beautiful. All right, Jesse, that was fun. We're gonna close out with some Q&As from patrons, and you hinted at some of them without meaning to during the chat. So, we've revamped our Patreon. And so if you want to hear more from Jesse and hear some of the Q&As from people like you, go sign up. If you want to hear that Q&A and other extra behind the scenes content from this episode and others, head over to patreon.com/testpiece to sign up now. Patrons also get their episodes early and ad-free. There's hours and hours of bonus content there to help you on your own path of going from good to great. Still not sure? There's a free 7-day trial for you to check it out. And to help the show grow, please share this episode with someone who would love it. Okay, see you next week.